celebrate the 150th anniversary of the magazine. Selected readings by James Fallows, Christopher Hitchens, William Langewiesche, and others. This is just over an hour. This program contains language that some may find offensive.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carla Cohen. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose, and I want to welcome everybody here tonight. Thanks for coming out in spite of the rain, which we, of course, need very badly, so we can make this kind of a rain dance. Congratulations to the Atlantic Monthly magazine. We are so pleased that you've chosen to celebrate your 150th anniversary with us. Thanks to David Bradley, the owner, who has been such a good friend of writing and books. My job is very simple tonight. I introduce Robert Vare, the editor-at-large of Atlantic, and he will introduce the writers who have joined us. Some among the scores of writers represented in this generous compendium, The American Idea. Robert Vare is an experienced writer and editor, having worked at the New Yorker and Rolling Stone before his stint at the Atlantic Monthly. It is he who chose and organized the pieces that are included here. He said in his introduction he did not expect to find in the magazine's archive such a, quote, splendid view of the many events and currents of American history. He has given each of the pieces an introduction and provides a context for the reader. He has also set the anthology free of what he calls free of a chronological organization, grouping the materials in a series of categories, which I'm sure he will want to talk about. I love this book from the minute that I saw an advance copy, and of course the finished book is much better. If I were teaching a course in American history, I would need no other text than this book. Congratulations to you, Robert, and to all of your contributors.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all, and nice to see so many familiar faces. And it's great to be back at Politics and Prose, which has got to be one of the outstanding bookstores in America, if not the world. We're here tonight to celebrate not just the publication of a new book, but also the 150th anniversary of a genuine American publishing institution. The Atlantic Monthly cannot lay claim to being the oldest magazine in America, I'm afraid. That distinction belongs to Scientific American, which was founded in 1845. And Town and Country and Harper's magazines were both founded a few years before the Atlantic. And yet, at the ripe old age of 150, the Atlantic does have the right to call itself America's oldest continuously published general interest magazine. By any standard, a sesquicentennial is a remarkable achievement, especially in a notoriously fragile sector of the publishing universe, where the average life expectancy of a new magazine, is something closer to 150 days, not 150 years. So how do we account for the Atlantic's astonishing longevity? You know, I wish I had a simple soundbite answer to that question. But when you look at the history of the magazine, I think a couple of important explanations do seem to come to the fore and begin to explain this remarkable longevity. The first has to do with the Atlantic's unusual genealogical tree. As some of you may know, the Atlantic was founded by a remarkable group, an illustrious group, representing some of the towering figures of 19th century American intellectual life. There was Ralph Waldo Emerson and Oliver Wendell Holmes and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and James Russell Lowell. At the time of the magazine's founding in 1857, these were the golden boys of American literature, philosophy, and science, and they set a pretty high standard for their successors to live up to. And I would like to add that unlike many other magazines that owe their start to usually to business people, investors, people on the publishing side, the Atlantic was started by a group largely consisting of writers, and I think that because of that, at its core, it has always been a writer's magazine. And if you think of it as a writer's magazine, you begin to understand how the Atlantic has managed to attract so many of the most esteemed and revered writers and thinkers of the last century and a half. The list of names is like a who's who in American literature. From novelists like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edith Wharton, William Faulkner, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, to scientists, Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, James Watson, Stephen Jay Gould, E.O. Wilson, from economists like John Maynard Keynes and John Kenneth Galbraith and Milton Friedman, to humorists like Mark Twain, H.L. Mencken, Garrison Keillor, and Ian Fraser, from muckrakers like Jacob Riis, Lincoln Steffens, and Henry Demarest Lloyd, the granddaddy of all muckrakers, to philosophers like William James, Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, from poets like Yeats, Wallace Stevens, Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, W.H. Auden, to future presidents. 3 future presidents wrote for the Atlantic before the White House was even a gleam in their eye. They were Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I like to think of if you think of the Atlantic as a writer's magazine started by writers with this remarkable genealogical tree, that I think would be one factor in its longevity. And a second factor I would point to is a few words that are embedded in a brief mission statement that the founders, whom I mentioned, published in the magazine's first issue. And these words are almost buried within the few quiet sentences of that mission statement, which sketched out editorial goals and policies. And it was an assertion that the magazine would be primarily dedicated to monitoring, exploring, and promoting something the founders called the American idea. Exactly what they meant by that term, they never made clear, either in their mission statement or in their public statements or private journals. But we can make some educated guesses about what they were talking about. Certainly, they were talking about political democracy. They were talking about personal freedom. They were talking about social justice, and they were probably talking about economic opportunity. All of those goals, after all, were enumerated and spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. And yet it is intriguing and even a little mystifying, to me at least, that the founders would give such weight to a term, this term, the American idea, that does not appear to have been in common use at the time. In retrospect, it's almost as though they had a certain confidence that their readers would know exactly what they had in mind. In any event, by invoking this simple 3-word phrase, the American idea, the founders managed to infuse their magazine with both an identity and a calling. And at bottom, I think they were making an implicit promise to their readers that the Atlantic would be taking on the large and perennially relevant questions of our national life. What does it mean to be an American? What constitutes the national interest? What should America's role in the world be? These questions are very much at the heart of who we are as a magazine, a major part of our genetic heritage. And I think it connects our work with the work of the founders and with that of all the other contributors to the magazine over the course of its history. And in very different ways, these questions inform the work of each of the writers whose articles in the anthology we honor here tonight. And with that, I would like to introduce our first participant in the panel tonight. We're going to have to scramble the order because certain people have been caught in traffic. But I'd like to turn now to the work of Saul Bellow, who is honored in the anthology with an excerpt from his great novel, Mr. Samler's Planet. The recipient of 3 National Book Awards, a Pulitzer Prize, and a Nobel Prize for Literature, Saul Bellow was one of the most honored writers of the 20th century. And yet, throughout his illustrious career as a writer and as a professor at the University of Chicago, where I was lucky enough to take a course with him in the 20th century novel, Bellow found himself with surprising frequency at the center of political firestorms, often as he himself was first to acknowledge of his own making. A Trotskyist as a young man, Bellow veered sharply to the right in response to the upheavals of the 1960s and became well known in both his novels and public statements for his pointed and sometimes inflammatory criticisms of the changes that were reshaping American culture, higher education, and race relations. Asked in a 1988 interview for his opinions of multiculturalism and non-Western literature that were then ascendant on college campuses, Bellow posed a famous question: who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus, the Proust of the Papuans? I'd be glad to meet him. That remark, for all its cleverness, sounded to some like a racial put-down. But perhaps the biggest controversy that the Chicago-bred novelist ever set off originated in the pages of The Atlantic. In late 1969, the magazine serialized 2 very large installments of Bellow's then forthcoming novel, Mr. Samler's Planet. At issue was Bellow's depiction of a black pickpocket, a physically imposing, magnificently dressed African-American male in his 30s who is spotted by the novel's title character, Arthur Samler.
Robert, I'm supposed to be doing
What?
this. Aren't I supposed to be
I'm going to, yes, you'll be doing this. There'll be plenty of time.
It's too comprehensive an introduction.
Okay. Christopher, I knew you'd be keeping me taking me to task, but just to move ahead, this depiction of the black pickpocket got Bellow in all kinds of trouble, and accusations of racial stereotyping and outright racism rained down on Bellow after that. In fact, one critic who actually was an admirer of Bellow's work, a man by the name of Joseph Epstein, maintained that Mr. Samler's Planet seemed designed to, quote, offend whole categories of the reading public, as well as most of the people who write about books. But other critics and readers rose to Bellow's defense, contending that the novelist had himself been victimized by an early upwelling of political correctness, and that he had properly exercised the prerogatives of fiction to present the menacing character of urban life in New York City as experienced by at least some of those who lived there. To celebrate the excerpt in the anthology and to honor the work of Saul Bellow, we're delighted to have with us here tonight an Atlantic contributing editor, a best-selling author, and a provocative essayist and cultural critic and literary critic, Christopher Hitchens. And I should say a Bellow-phile second to none, who has an excellent piece in the current 150th anniversary issue on Saul Bellow. And I'm sorry, Christopher, if I said that.
I just thought your introduction was in danger of becoming too generous, if not, in fact, preemptive. And I've only got a few minutes with you, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to make the best use of them. I want to first give you a sense of how Bellow writes, setting a scene of an old Jew, Holocaust survivor, immigrant to the United States, who has to ride the bus and doesn't like what he sees. Shortly after dawn, or what would have been dawn in a normal sky, Mr. Arthur Samler, with his bushy eye, took in the books and papers of his West Side bedroom and suspected strongly that they were the wrong books, the wrong papers. In a way, it did not matter much to a man of 70 plus, and at leisure. He thought, since he had no job to wake up to, that he might give sleep a second chance to resolve certain difficulties imaginatively for him, and pulled up the disconnected electric blanket with its internal sinews and lumps. It was time to be conscious. Very great the way Bellow can summon anomie and alienation, and the antinomies of that, I think. Soon comes back to him why he's woken somewhat distressed. For several days, Mr. Samler, returning on the customary bus, had been watching a pickpocket at work. The man got on at Columbus Circle. The job, the crime, was done by 72nd Street. Mr. Samler, if he'd not been a tall strap hanger, would not, with his one good eye, have seen these things happening. But now he wondered whether he had not drawn too close, whether he had also been seeing. The pickpocket himself wore dark shades. He was a powerful Negro in a camel's hair coat, dressed with extraordinary elegance, as if by Mr. Fish of London or Turnbull and Asser of Jermyn Street. Mr. Samler knew his England. The Negro's perfect circles of gentian violet banded with lovely gold turned towards Samler, but the face showed the effrontery of a big animal. Samler was not timid. You see how Bellow's asking for trouble here. Don't need any underlining from me, but I'm going to underline it anyway. Samler was not timid, but he had had as much trouble in life as he wanted. A good deal of this would never be accommodated. He suspected the criminal was aware that a tall old white man, passing as blind, had seen the minutest details of his crimes, staring down, as if watching open-heart surgery. And though he dissembled, deciding not to turn aside when the thief looked at him, his elderly, his compact, civilized face colored strongly, the short hairs bristled, the lips and gums were stinging. He felt a constriction, a clutch of sickness at the base of the skull, where the nerves, muscles, and blood vessels were tightly interlaced. The breath of wartime Poland passing over the damaged tissues, that nerve spaghetti, as he thought of it. Finely wrought, I hope you agree. Now, to the crisis point, when he realizes, and the pickpocket realizes, that they both understand each other, and he follows Mr. Samler home. Everybody's nightmare in New York that year, that a large person of color, let's be honest, will follow you back and knows where you live and will come into your apartment. And while the doorman can't be bothered and is looking after the elevator, will say something, and Mr. Samler will say, "What's the matter? What do you want?" He was never to hear the black man's voice. He no more spoke than a puma would. Puma. What he did was to force Samler into a corner beside the long blackish carved table, a sort of Renaissance piece, by the buckling canvas of the old wall. There the man held Samler against the wall with his forearm. The umbrella fell to the floor with a sharp crack of the ferrule on the tile. It was ignored. The pickpocket unbuttoned himself. Samler heard the zipper descend. Then the smoke glasses were removed from Samler's face and dropped on the table. He was directed silently to look downward. I should rephrase that. He was directed silently to look downward. The black man had opened his fly and taken out his penis. It was displayed to Samler with the great oval testicles, a large tan and purple uncircumcised thing, a tube, a snake. Metallic hairs bristled at the thick base, and the tip curled beyond the supporting, demonstrating hand, suggesting the fleshy mobility of an elephant's trunk, though the skin was somewhat iridescent rather than thick or rough. Over the forearm and fist that held him, Samler was required to gaze at this organ. No compulsion would have been necessary. He would in any case have looked. Okay, you may think that's enough of that, but Bellow clearly wants you to be able to see it and, if you like, feel it. And he's taken the most daring allegory of what we used to call race relations that it's really possible to imagine, not just street crime, though this time conducted by a man beautifully dressed and very elegant and very skillful, but the alleged sexual and, it has to be said, animal threat posed by, just in the minds of some white people, by African Americans, Africans in fact, Mr. Bellow, I haven't got time to dilate very much on this, but I'd like to say a few words, partly in his defense and partly in his criticism on this. Mr. Bellow, towards the end of his days, regretted what he'd said about the Tolstoy of the Zulus and the Proust of the Papuans, and actually said that one of the books that had most influenced him was a book about Chaka, the great Zulu king, a study of Chaka and the Zulu kingdom. And I don't think he was doing this just to make nice, because I know for other reasons that when he wrote Henderson the Rain King, one of his earliest novels, I hope some of you at least have read that. The only one, by the way, with a non-Jewish protagonist, a sort of Hemingway-esque adventure into Africa. That he read about 200 books about Africa in order to familiarize himself enough to do this, and took it very seriously and was very stirred by what he found. I think that what we're facing here with Mr. Samler and this antagonist is a very distraught allegory that became apparent to a number of people, or if it didn't become apparent, this is what I say in my essay in the Current Atlantic, began to occur as an allegory to a number of people in about 1969, which was that there was a connection somehow, maybe subliminal, between the battle between Israel and the Arabs in the Middle East, and between Jewish and black Americans in particularly Brooklyn, New York, and Chicago. If you remember, there was a famous strike in Ocean Hills that year. It went on for about 2 years. Jewish teachers against community control of schools, terrific accusations of an anti-Semitic kind made against Albert Shanker. Many of the slogans and banners replicating what was being said at the time in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And I think this made to Bellow a mockery of what had been the old progressive idea of an alliance between black and Jewish people of a progressive kind. And you can find this in his book on Jerusalem and his non-fiction work, To Jerusalem and Back, where he rather describes Jerusalem as an embattled sea of civilization in the midst of an ocean of backwardness and barbarism. And you can pick up the echoes of it in many of his other works as well. And the best I can say in closing is that he registers it honestly, doesn't make any pretense of not feeling or not fearing what he knew many people were feeling and were fearing, doesn't appeal, in my judgment, to anything foul or bigoted or primitive in his reading, and feels above all the obligation to state honestly what is really on people's minds. And I hope that it will always be felt by the Atlantic that it's our job to face questions of this kind, however distraught they may seem. So thank you for listening, and thank you for coming. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christopher. We're going to move from Saul Bellow to Saddam Hussein now. For months after the next article on our program tonight was assigned, it was affectionately known around the offices of the Atlantic as The Sex Life of Saddam Hussein. But that title, I think, belied the project's serious objective, which was to provide readers not with just with the detailed pictures of Saddam's daily life from the moment he woke up in the morning till the moment he went to bed at night, but really with a plumb line into the depths of his psyche. And as a high-profile player on the world stage for many years, Saddam Hussein had inspired innumerable articles and books. The emphasis almost always on his tribal past, his opulent lifestyle, and his murderous regime. But rarely had the Iraqi dictator been written about with this level on this level of intimacy. For this ambitious assignment, the magazine's editors turned to Mark Bowden, the author of an international bestseller, Black Hawk Down, and a former reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, with an unusual gift for the narrative-driven profile. Unable to gain an audience with Saddam himself, Mark's request, which was sent through the Iraqi consulate in New York, was basically ignored. Mark, nevertheless, managed to track down and interview many Iraqi exiles, both foes and allies of Saddam alike. And he traveled to cities as far-flung as Detroit and Rome, for his reporting. And I think it's this intensive reporting that really informs this story, which is called Tales of the Tyrant, an article that in its steady accretion of personal, often mundane details, is at once demonizing and surprisingly humanizing. In Mark Bowden's impressionistic portrait, Saddam is not, as he is often depicted, a cartoon monster, but really a deformed man, hopelessly corrupted by his own vainglory and pathetically constrained by his own power. I'm delighted that we have Atlantic National correspondent Mark Bowden with us here tonight.
Well, thank you very much. It's really nice to see this many people turn out. I am often asked, particularly by young journalists, how they could get my job, which is writing these wonderful pieces for the Atlantic. And I tell them that it really is simple, that you just have to write a best-selling book. And then everybody kind of beats a path to your door. Actually, I began writing for the Atlantic soon after, I guess, the success of Black Hawk Down. Actually, Robert, you're the one who called me and solicited something from me. And I met with Michael Kelly, who was just a delightful, pugnacious character, who assigned me this story in the summer of 2001. And Michael, for those of you who are familiar with him, wrote a book about the first Persian Gulf War called Martyrs' Day, which is a fantastic piece of reporting and writing, and had remained passionately interested in that part of the world, so much so that he got himself embedded with the military unit when the United States invaded Iraq and was killed, the first American journalist killed in Iraq. But this idea of trying to write a profile of Saddam Hussein, who was both one of the most famous people in the world and one of the least known people in the world at the same time, was his. And I had just begun working on it when there were the attacks on 9/11. And I remember Michael called me on that day, and he said, "Mark, I want you to just drop that story about Saddam Hussein. I want you to start thinking about something having to do with what's happening today. And I don't know what that story is going to be, but at some point, over the next few weeks and months, we'll figure out what it's going to be. And I want you to, think big, and we're going to, try and do something really important." And so I thought about this for several weeks after 9/11, and I kept coming back to just the preliminary work I had done on this story about Saddam Hussein and how much I liked this idea. So I got Michael on the phone finally, and I said, "Michael, I want to stay with this Saddam Hussein story. I know that the rest of the world is going to be focused on the attacks of 9/11, and I'm sure that many people will be writing about this, and there will be plenty of books. But I've always been taught by my mentor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, Gene Roberts, to zig when everyone else zags." And I said, "I kind of like this as a zig, And the reason, and Michael was completely supportive of this and said, "Go ahead, continue to pursue the story about Saddam." I, of course, was not going to get to meet Saddam. I did try. I sent my request for an interview to the Iraqi consulate in New York, and they turned me down. And I tried again, and they turned me down again. But it was an opportunity for me to actually test a principle that I have taught to young journalists, and that is that that one of the less important aspects of any profile is the interview with the person that you're writing about. And it's far more important to observe and to report. And so that meant finding people who knew Saddam personally. And there weren't that many. It was hard to find people who had had personal interactions with Saddam Hussein. But there was a fairly significant body of expatriates, of people who had fled Iraq or who had fled Saddam, some of whom who had worked very closely with him for a number of years. And I was able to find and interview a wide variety of people who at different stages of Saddam's life had known him. I ended up with a lot of impressions from people, fascinating things, insights into Saddam the person, but without a really coherent idea of how to structure an article about him. Now, one of the things that I also think most people don't realize about journalism, or the kind of writing I do anyway, is how much you borrow from other people whose work you admire. And one of the journalists who I have long greatly admired is the Polish writer Ryszard Kapuscinski, who died just, I guess, earlier this year. And I had read a book by Kapuscinski called The Shah of Shahs, which was a profile. It was both a profile and it was kind of an analysis of the Iranian Revolution, but it was a profile of the Shah of Iran. And I'm sure that Kapuscinski had been in roughly the same position that I was in, and that he had a lot of information about the Shah, but he was never going to form a personal impression of the guy because he was never going to get within a quarter mile of him. And in that book, the way he wrote it was very impressionistic. Each chapter basically begins with an artifact. I think the first chapter is a photograph, a snapshot of the Shah as a young man with his family, which prompts Kapuscinski to go off on a very penetrating essay, short essay, of ideas about the Shah that were spurred by this artifact, this photograph. Well, I didn't have artifacts of Saddam Hussein, but I love that way of structuring the story, and it seemed to me to be a perfect solution to the kind of story where you have a lot of sort of disparate information and no real central narrative threads. So the piece that I ended up writing for The Atlantic was structured around concepts and passages from Saddam's speeches, his rants, which he gave frequently. And the idea ultimately was to put yourself in the skin of the dictator. Clearly, Saddam Hussein, as evil as the rest of the world thought him to be, and believe me, he had plenty of claim to the throne, looked at himself in the mirror every day and no doubt did not say to himself, aha, here is the most evil man in the world. I'm sure that he had his own way of thinking about himself. And so that was really my goal in this story. I'll read you just the first short paragraph of the piece to give you an idea of the kind of intimacy that we were looking for in this story. The tyrant must steal sleep. He must vary the locations and times. He never sleeps in his palaces. He moves from secret bed to secret bed. Sleep and a fixed routine are among the few luxuries denied him. It is too dangerous to be predictable, and whenever he shuts his eyes, the nation drifts. His iron grip slackens. Plots congeal in the shadows. For those hours, he must trust someone, and nothing is more dangerous to the tyrant than trust. The idea was to get personal with Saddam, and I think it was an interesting challenge for me. It's the kind of thing that this magazine allows writers to do. I love writing for The Atlantic because of that opportunity, because they give me a lot of space to write long. I've always battled with newspaper editors to write longer and longer stories. And I also love the fact that The Atlantic is not a partisan vehicle, that it doesn't represent any identifiable ideological stripe, that it's interested in giving journalists and writers an independent opportunity to express themselves and to arrive at what they really think about something. My own goal in any story I write for The Atlantic is to work on it until I arrive at an independent understanding of whatever it is I'm writing about. So whether you ultimately agree with me or not, you know if you read a piece by me, or I think by William or Christopher or anyone who writes for The Atlantic, that you are getting the writer's honest, straightforward ideas and opinions, not preformed or designed to fit a kind of an ideological pattern. And no one could be more proud than I am to be just here with the folks that I'm here with, or to be in this collection. It's really one of the highlights of my career. Thank you.
If anybody would like to take a seat, we have a lot of seats over here on my right, so you won't have to say, excuse me, please, and climb over people if you don't want to. I'm sorry, Robert.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm not sure that everyone in the room will agree with the following assertion, but hi, Christopher. But I think the run-up to the Iraq War was not exactly the American media's finest hour, and we could debate this later. In the months before the conflict, much of the reporting emanating from the major news organizations seemed to sound a steady drumbeat, sounded an amen chorus for the Bush administration's unannounced but readily apparent invasion plans. One of the few journalists who did not buy into the conventional wisdom about the blessings that regime change would bring to Iraq was the Atlantic's longtime national correspondent, James Fallows. In a remarkably prophetic cover story called The 51st State, which was published in November of 2002, a full 6 months before the invasion of Iraq, Jim Fallows leapfrogged over the question that seemed to preoccupy most other journalists at the time: how quickly would Saddam be deposed? And raised the larger questions that very few, and certainly not the chief architects of the war, seemed to be asking. What would happen next? Drawing on dozens of interviews with military strategists and Middle East experts, Jim Fallows was able to construct elaborate scenarios that prefigured with extraordinary accuracy nearly the entire catalog of problems and dangers and pitfalls that the American-led occupation has had to face since the overthrow of Saddam. Just for example, the breakdown of security and civil order, the absence of political power needed to control potential insurgencies, the decimation of infrastructure needed for water and electricity, the looming threat of civil war due to rising sectarian violence, and the probability of a protracted occupation in the absence of clear goals for withdrawal. As a follow-up to the 51st State, which won a National Magazine Award in 2003, Jim Fallows went on to produce a series of related articles for The Atlantic that, taken as a whole, represent one of the most comprehensive indictments of the Bush administration's conduct of the war. These articles have been collected in a book called Blind into Baghdad, and they have brought Jim's unusual gifts for interviewing and document sifting and synthesizing to a very large national audience. As David Shaw, the Los Angeles Times media critic, said in a column several years ago, if Jim Fallows is not the best journalist of his generation, he is certainly in the top half dozen. I feel doubly blessed because Jim was on the panel with us in Boston, and now here he is in Washington, D.C., and it's an honor to have Jim Fallows joining us here tonight.
Thank you very much, Robert, for your gracious introduction. Thank you all for coming out. There are many friends of the Atlantic family here, many friends of my own family. I'm glad to see you and proud to do so in this context. I want to say briefly a word about this book that Robert and Dan Smith have put together, a word about the magazine and something it represents, and then a word about the way I approach this story and what that shows about the role that the Atlantic has tried to have. And I'll read very briefly from the end of the story, as Mark was reading from the beginning of his. Carla mentioned earlier that she thought this one book would be an adequate history text. I would go farther than that. When I was in college, my concentration was American history and literature. I think this one book would obviate much of what we read. It's an astonishing achievement. As Mark was saying a moment ago, it makes mere mortals like the current employees of the magazine feel honored and ennobled and embarrassed in a way to be included in the ranks of the people here. So I think that if you read this book, you will not be sorry. It's a remarkable tradition that it includes, and that Robert and Dan did a very amazing job of having head notes, introductions, excerpts of the whole thing. So I recommend, this is a book event, but even beyond that, this is a superb book. Say something about the Atlantic, which is observing its 150 years. I am both proud and a little bit awkward to know that for nearly 1/5 of that time, I've been on the staff of the magazine. I have the same mixed feelings in knowing that I can remember and see in my mind my father going to the mailbox in Redlands, California, and taking out the 100th anniversary issue of the Atlantic Monthly, which had come to our house, and making the squirming elementary school kids, which were me and my siblings, listen as he read an essay by James Thurber, which was part of that because my dad was trying to polish his humorist skills, and he thought this would be a way to do it. And I remember in college how excited I was to go to the newsstand and see the latest issues with Saul Bellow's novel, with reportage from Vietnam and all the rest. It is a wonderful magazine. I think it is still the case that my proudest moment in journalism when I was living in Texas and had my first article published in the Atlantic Monthly, a profile of Lloyd Benson, then an aspirant to the presidency, and thought, I still have on my wall that first issue, the first time had my name in it. I've had the privilege of working for 5 editors there, and there's a point I will make about them. Bob Manning, the man who hired me, Bill Whitworth, who was there for 20 years, Mike Kelly, about whom Mark spoke, Cullen Murphy, who was there also for 20 years, and now James Bennett. They all have been superb. I've been honored to work for all of them. Cullen, at the event in Boston, made a point which I think applies to almost no other publication I can think of. Cullen also knew all these people, and he said he considered all of them his personal friends. So to have 30 years of 5 editors changing with the turmoils that go with the magazine, still feel this bond, says something about the continuity of the magazine that is represented here. I've worked for 3 owners of the magazine. We are honored to have by far the best at the helm now and in our presence here. I think he's over in the corner, David Bradley. So that's my advertisement for the magazine and for this book. Let me say something about the article that I did that Robert was explaining and what it shows about an aspect of the Atlantic that I think is not appreciated by people who don't have to actually put the thing out. We are a monthly magazine. That might be evident to you from our name. What is not so evident is that if you have a monthly magazine, you have to think amazingly far ahead of time of what you're going to do. It takes usually, if you take into account the time for reporting a story and writing it and doing the fact checking and doing all the things that are required to have a good looking magazine come out, usually it's 6 to 8 months between the time you think of an idea and when it actually comes to a reader's mailbox or sits in the newsstand or is on the web for the month end. And it requires a particular kind of vision, which our editors have had in uncommon and fortunate abundance to be able to say, we think there's something that 6 or 8 months from now will be interesting to people, will change their minds, and yet won't in the meantime either be entirely made meaningless by events or will be done to death by the New York Times or whoever else have more horses to deploy on the subject than we do. And this is a skill that that the editors have had. I mention that because it was the genesis of the story for me. I'd been living on the West Coast in Seattle and Berkeley for 3 years before returning to D.C. in 2001. My wife and I moved to Washington on September 9th, 2001. On the morning of September 11th, of course, 2001, the first person I heard from, like Mark, was Mike Kelly. And the cell phone suddenly worked, and Mike said, go downtown, look and see what's going on. He was in Boston then. We have to change all of our plans and figure out what to do. And he made the point that even though we can't be timely, even though it's going to be 6 months before we publish our next story, he wanted the magazine to distinguish itself in this huge moment in national history. And I think through William's work, which you'll hear more about, Common Ground, Mark's work, The Tyrant, Christopher's essays, I think lots of other reportage. We did distinguish ourselves in breaking news that we were able to cover with this very long lead time. The effect this had on me is that I was, while others were going off to their various missions, I was supposed to work on the D.C. policy front. And early in 2002, I think it was in March in 2002, when Mike Kelly was on other projects, Cullen Murphy came to me and said, "We know this war is going to come, or we're 95% sure. We know we're going to win. And we also know that probably for quite a while, nobody is going to get around to reporting what happens after we win. So let's get on that story." So starting in March of 2002, for about the next 3 or 4 months, I interviewed everybody I could find who knew about occupations, who knew about victories, people who knew about how Iraq worked, people who knew what was extrapolatable or not from the occupations of, you name it, Haiti, the Philippines. And so I had a long set of interviews with these people. I wrote a sort of timeline of what you expect after a week and after a month and after a year. Some of the things that I wrote, I would write differently if I could do it five years later. But most of the findings that people told me were depressingly prescient in the way what they had said. Let me read now just from the end, which is out of sync and away from the rest of the article, because I try to take a more positive approach there. And this is the way this article ended. "So far, we've considered the downside, which, to be fair, is most of what I heard in my interviews. But there was also a distinctly positive theme, and it came from some of the most dedicated members of the War Party. Their claim, again, was that forcing regime change would have not just a negative virtue, that of removing a threat. It would also create the possibility of bringing to Iraq, and eventually the whole Arab world, something that is never known before: stable democracy in an open market system. Quote, "This could be the golden opportunity to begin to change the face of the Arab world." James Woolsey, a former CIA director who's one of the most visible advocates of war, told me, quote, "Just as what we did in Germany changed the face of Central and Eastern Europe, here we have the golden chance." Unquote. In this view, the fall of the Soviet Empire really did mark what Francis Fukuyama had called the end of history. The democratic capitalist model showed its superiority over other social systems. This model has many local variations, it brings adjustment problems, and it encounters resistance, such as the anti-globalization protests of the late 1990s. But it spreads. Through the old Soviet territory, through Latin America and Asia, and nearly everywhere except through tragic Africa and the Islamic Arab lands of the Middle East. To think that Arab states don't want a democratic future is dehumanizing in this view. To think they're incapable of it is worse. What is required is a first Arab democracy, and Iraq can be the place. I skipped ahead to some other analyses of this theme, then went to say Richard Pearl, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and many others have presented similar prospects. At a Pentagon briefing a few days in August, Rumsfeld asked rhetorically, "Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if Iraq were similar to Afghanistan," meaning something different at that time. "If a bad regime were thrown out, people were liberated, food would come in, borders would be opened, repression would stop, prisons would be opened. I mean, it would be fabulous." This transforming vision is not, to put it mildly, the consensus among those with long experience in the Middle East. Quote, "It is so divorced from any historical context, just so far out of court, that it is laughable." Chris Sanders, a British official, told me, "There isn't a society in Iraq to turn into a democracy. That doesn't mean you can set up institutions, put stooges in them, but it would make about as much sense as the South Vietnamese experiment did." Others had similar arguments. Woolsey and his allies might be criticized for lacking a tragic imagination about where war might lead, but at least they recognize that it will lead somewhere. If they are more optimistic in their conclusions than most of the other people I spoke with, they do see that America's involvement in Iraq would be intimate and would be very long. It has become a cliche in popular writing about the natural world that small disturbances to complex systems can have unpredictably large effects. The world of nations is perhaps not quite as intricate as the natural world, but it certainly holds the potential for great surprise. Merely itemizing the foreseeable effects of war with Iraq suggests reverberations that would be felt for decades. If we can judge from past wars, the effects we can't imagine when the fighting begins will prove to be the ones that matter most. Thank you.
Give William a copy of the book.
Yeah, of course.
You have 3 minutes to read the whole thing. You know, both Mark and Jim referred to getting phone calls from Mike Kelly the day after 9/11, and the day of 9/11, and I think William Langewiesche was also on the receiving end of a phone call from Mike, who was the editor-in-chief, and Cullen Murphy, the managing editor at that time. And the purpose of the call, of course, was to hash out exactly how he might best contribute to the magazine's coverage of the tragedy and its aftermath. One option was to fly William, who was at home in Northern California, to Pakistan, from which he would make his way into Afghanistan and join up with the Northern Alliance as it waged war against al-Qaeda's Taliban sponsors. And another idea was to dispatch him to New York City to chronicle the frenetic rescue and recovery operation that was then already well underway amid the ruins of the World Trade Center. As soon as the ban on air travel was lifted, William flew to New York and took a quick reading of the disaster scene, trying to determine which municipal officials and agencies would be entrusted with the huge job of removing the tons of rubble and locating the thousands of victims lying buried deep within. At first, William was stymied in his efforts to secure access to the site, both by stonewalling officials of the city's Office of Emergency Management, the agency ostensibly in charge of the operation of the rescue and recovery, and by the legions of reporters who were queuing up for press credentials at police headquarters. But there was a piece of serendipity here, because it turned out that a man by the name of Kenneth Holden, who was the commissioner of a relatively small, little-known city agency called the Department of Design and Construction, was a longtime fan of Williams, and this particular agency was emerging as the de facto supervisor of the Ground Zero operations. For the next 9 months, William Langewiesche was the sole journalist to have not only round-the-clock freedom to interview supervisors, contractors, and workers excavating the so-called pile, but also unrestricted entree to prolonged strategy sessions and seat-of-the-pants problem-solving meetings among the key players. It's interesting that for all the devastation and carnage that William encountered day after day on the pile, he found a surprisingly inspiring story to tell, one of extraordinary resourcefulness and resilience. And in this excerpt that's in the anthology, which represents some of the first installment of a 3-part article, which at 70,000 words was the longest piece that the Atlantic of original reporting that the Atlantic had ever published, William ended his writing this way. Despite the apocalyptic nature of the scene, the response was unhesitant and almost childishly optimistic. It was simply understood that you would find survivors and then you would find the dead, and that you would work night and day to clean up the mess, and that this would allow the world's greatest city to rebuild quickly and maybe even make itself into something better than before. These are the last words of the anthology, and this is the last piece in the book, and I think it's completely fitting that this close the book, and I'm just a great pleasure to have William Langewiesche here with us tonight. Thank you, William.
Thank you. So we can relive our glories here. It was an odd piece, but let me talk about the Atlantic. Before doing this piece, I don't know at what point, I've been working for the Atlantic at that point for maybe 10 years or so. There came a time, I started as a pilot, and I drifted into writing from flying airplanes. And then for a while, the Atlantic, Bill Whitworth and Cullen Murphy wanted me to write the occasional aviation piece, and I really didn't want to write it. And so I did a few aviation pieces for them, but this was coming up too much. I didn't want to be an aviation writer when I grew up. So I told Cullen, you know, that's it, Cullen, one day in Boston, I'm not writing any more airplane pieces. That's it. I quit. You know, I'll write about the real things in life. And he said, oh, please, William, you can write anything you want to write about airplanes. And I thought, okay, Cullen, let me think of something really you're not going to publish. And so I thought about it for maybe 10, 15 seconds. And I said, okay, I'm going to write about how to turn an airplane, Cullen. And I'm going to publish that? And he said, yes. So, so it was a bit of a problem for me. And I wrote the piece, and it was actually very successful. I mean, I think for the magazine it was successful, and they published it. I mean, so that's the kind of magazine The Atlantic is. It was a good piece. Yeah, it turned out to. So that's the kind of editor Cullen Murphy was, and so yeah, I mean, Atlantic Monthly. Now the shift scene to 9/11, and this disaster, and the idea was well, okay, go to Pakistan and the Northern Alliance. That was the obvious thing to do, back into war, or see about this rebuilding or cleanup effort. Again, it's sort of like writing about the turn. I mean, of all boring things to write about, I mean, the very idea that you would go put a journalist on the ground for 9 months and pay his expenses and publish some long thing about garbage, which is all this was. It was garbage. Okay, it was emotional garbage, and you know, it was big garbage, but it was garbage. It was like writing about a junk pile, and well, they wanted me to do it, and when the access occurred, much to our surprise. Then the typical, by this time it was really Mike Kelly with all of his energy and ambition for the magazine, and it was just the green light. We don't care how long it takes. We don't care how much it costs. We don't care that none of us knew what was going on, what would happen, what was going to be interesting. No idea. We just knew that we had access, and so we proceeded. I'll read a little bit from it. I think as far as the techniques that I used in this case, it's probably natural to me in that when I snuck into the site basically, and before sending the fax to Ken Holden, I didn't know who this guy was, but I figured I saw all of this emotion, and I didn't feel very emotional about what had happened. I mean, it was a bad thing and all that, but I wasn't blown out of the water by the fall of the Twin Towers, nor by the attacks of 9/11. Personally, it was just war, and I saw that once I got past the soldiers. The National Guard, they were protecting the site from evil people like me, and I realized that, you know, bless the hearts of all the people who were digging with shovels in their hands, but it wasn't doing any good because the debris was too heavy. So if you're going to find the living, and that was the attempt at the time, people thought there would be the living trapped inside. It turned out not to be true, but you had to bring in heavy equipment, and so I asked who's bringing in the heavy equipment, and somebody said this thing called a DDC. And we went from there. But the sort of the source of that idea of asking who's bringing the heavy equipment, I described here briefly. And I write here, people who came to the site in those early days often had the same first sensation of leaving the city and walking into a dream. Many also felt when they saw the extent of the destruction that they had stumbled into a war zone. It's like something you'd see in the movies, people said. Probably so, but my own reaction was different when I first went in soon after the attacks. After years of traveling through the back corners of the world, I had an unexpected sense not of the strangeness of this scene, but of its familiarity. Wading through the debris on the streets, climbing through the newly torn landscapes, breathing in the mixture of smoke and dust, it was as if I had wandered again into the special havoc that failing societies tend to visit upon themselves. This time, they had visited it upon us. The message seemed to be, here is a sample of our political science. I was impressed by how faithfully the effects had been reproduced on the ground. Now, of course, this was not the Middle East. This was New York City, and New York City, I mean, unfortunately for the rest of the United States, is not the United States. I mean, New York City is New York City. It is the supreme, the ultimate city on earth, and well, you all know it, of course. And so what happened there was it was very American, but it was also very New York. And I don't believe now, looking back on it, that the reactions that I chronicled in this series would have occurred elsewhere in the United States. We have today huge evidence of the cowardice that occurred in the rest of the country. But what I saw was not cowardice. And inside the opaque walls, beyond all of the hype about heroism, was this beautiful experiment in solving problems, in solving a very serious problem. I'll read you a little bit about that. So in other countries, learned committees would have been formed and high authorities consulted. The ruins would have been pondered and a tightly scripted response would have been imposed. Barring that, soldiers would have assumed control. But for whatever reasons, probably cultural, probably profound, little of the sort happened among those ruins where the learned committees were excluded and the soldiers were relegated to the unhappy role of guarding the perimeter, and civilians in heavy machines simply rolled in and took on the unknown. Nearly everyone at the site was well paid. The money for the effort came from federal emergency funds and it flowed freely. But despite some serious cases of corruption and greed, money was not the main motivation here, at least not until almost the end. Throughout the winter and into the spring, the workers rarely forgot the original act of aggression, or the fact that nearly 3,000 people had died there, including the friends and relatives of some who were toiling in the debris. They were reminded of this constantly, not by the frequent discovery of human remains and the somber visits from grieving families, but also by the emotional response of America as a whole and the powerful new iconography that was associated with the disaster. These New York firemen as tragic heroes, these skeletal walls, these smoking ruins as America's hallowed ground. Whether correctly or not, the workers believed that an important piece of history was playing out, and they wanted to participate in it, often fervently, and past the point of fatigue. From the start, that was the norm. There were some who could not stand the stress, and they had to leave. But among the thousands who stayed, almost all sought greater involvement rather than less. The truth is that people relished the experience. It's obvious that they would never have wished this calamity on themselves or others, but inside the perimeter lines and beyond the public's view, it served for many of them as an unexpected liberation, a national tragedy, of course, but one that was contained, unambiguous, and surprisingly energizing. Was this not war after all? Probably it was, though at some early and entirely willing stage of the fighting, people believed wholeheartedly that they were righting a wrong and that it was their duty to act quickly. The urgency of the job swept away ordinary responsibilities and the everyday dullness of family life, and it made nonsense of office paperwork and tedious professional routines. Traditional hierarchies broke down too. The problems that had to be solved were largely unprecedented. Action and invention were required on every level, often with no need or possibility of asking permission. As a result, within the vital new culture that grew up at the Trade Center site, even the lowliest laborers and firemen were given power. Many of them rose to it, and some of them sank. Among those who gained the greatest influence were people without previous rank who discovered balance and ability within themselves, and who in turn were discovered by others. The unexpected ones were frontline firemen and construction workers, young engineers, and obscure city employees. Their success in the midst of chaos was an odd twist in the story of these monolithic buildings that in the final stretch of the 20th century had stood so visibly for the totalitarian ideals of planning and control. But the buildings were not buildings anymore, and the place where they fell had become a tabula rasa for the United States. Among the ruins now, a large and unscripted experiment in American life had gotten away. I'll say one more thing about it, just on a personal note. I was very consumed by what was going on there. I was working 7 days a week. My job was to try to make something of this for my beloved editors and readers, and it was a constant concern. So I had no time to read the newspaper. I had no time to do anything other than to be at the site and deal with the work that I was doing. No time. So I was quite unaware of what was happening elsewhere in the United States at the same time. I mean, I knew about the idiocy of shutting down the airlines for 3 days. I knew a few basics like that, but I was not aware of the level of reaction and pathology that was rising in the rest of the country outside of this site. I had an unduly optimistic view of the reaction to 9/11 because I was at the World Trade Center site. I regret that today. I regret that I did not put, it wasn't my assignment, it wasn't my mandate, but I think the piece would have been better had I mentioned in a few words, acknowledged in a few words, that elsewhere in the country things were not going so well. Having said that, let me recommend what seems to me perhaps to be the best piece in this beautiful anthology. And if you're buying the book, well, you'll find it, by George Kennan. I just would like, I'm not going to speak about it. It was written in the 1950s in reaction to the McCarthy hysteria. And the title is The Illusion of Security. It is a book, it is a piece which applies today to our problems, who we are, what we have become, what we are doing in Iraq, what we are doing to our civil liberties, what we have done, the damage that probably cannot be undone. Where is George Kennan? Read this piece. It's also a beautiful piece of writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been such a celebration of writing. It's very moving to see how much this kind of writing can illuminate our world and teach us things that we didn't know and that we need to know, and whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for coming down. It was very good of you. And the authors will be here to sign.
The American Idea, the best of the Atlantic Monthly, is edited by Robert Vare. For more, visit theatlantic.com.